It's October 16th, 2009. In East Berlin, the newly restored Neues Museum is about to reopen its doors. The museum holds the finest collection of Egyptian artifacts in Germany. But its biggest attraction is the arrival of one of Egypt's most famous queens, the bust of Nefertiti. This masterpiece had been on display at the Altes Museum in Berlin for the past 20 years. Now, Nefertiti is coming home to become the star of the new museum. I think it's an absolute masterpiece, truly timeless. It really is perfection, full of aesthetic value. It shows ideal beauty. But where does it come from? Life itself made her a star. It's a bit like the Mona Lisa, a symbol of Egyptian identity. Nefertiti is over 3,000 years old. Great care is taken to make sure her flawless face isn't damaged. She's in remarkably good condition, and that's one of the great mysteries of archaeological history. But the party was spoiled by some breaking news from Geneva that quickly spread through the media. The claim that the Nefertiti bust is actually a fake. This controversial accusation came after a 20-year investigation by author and historian Henri Stierlin. I have no doubt in my mind that it's fake, a copy, a forgery, or a model. What first made scholars skeptical was the unique state of preservation of the bust when it was discovered. Something didn't add up. It looked nothing like any other 3,300-year-old Egyptian bust. To Stierlin, the bust seemed just too perfectly preserved, almost too new to be real. Plus, there was a second bust found next to Nefertiti's, a bust of her husband, Pharaoh Akhenaten, but his was completely damaged. So why the huge difference in condition when they were found at the same time and place? Could Nefertiti really be fake? In Montpellier, southern France, archaeologist and Egyptologist Marc Gabold, also an expert on Nefertiti, considered Stierlin's claims. I have to say he was right to ask the question, but the arguments he presented aren't necessarily strong enough. If he could show me some solid scientific evidence that it's a forgery, I'd accept it. There's definitely room for doubt. In the basement of the Neues Museum in Berlin, a press conference was held. Journalists took notes, but no one dared to ask about the authenticity accusations. In Germany, such accusations are almost taboo. After all, the bust, discovered a century ago in Egypt by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, has become a national icon. We put the question directly to Friedrich Seefried, director of the Neues Museum. When you stand in front of the bust, that question doesn't even cross your mind. It goes without saying that it's authentic. The real question is, why would it be fake? Many archaeologists, American, Italian, French, have expressed doubts about whether the bust is genuine, but none have publicly stated their doubts. So we decided to do our own investigation. Everyone is extremely cautious. Nobody dares say outright that it might be fake. Is Egypt's most famous ancient bust really a forgery? To find out, we met top experts, gave the bust a kind of lie detector test, and retraced its history. What we discovered during our research might forever change how you see the mysterious Egyptian queen and her famous likeness. Who was Nefertiti? She remains one of the great mysteries of ancient Egypt. Over the years, archaeologists have examined every monument, every hieroglyph on every column and temple wall, searching for the slightest evidence of her existence. They went as far as Karnak, one of Egypt's greatest religious centers, hoping to find traces of Queen Nefertiti. Deep in that maze of columns and temples, they finally found her first image, carved in stone from a now-lost temple. But almost nothing is known about her origins. Maybe she was Egyptian, probably the wife of the great pharaoh Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty. Nefertiti was Akhenaten's main wife, the only one allowed to hold the title Great Royal Wife. We know the queen's sisters, we know her nurse, but nothing about her family background. Honestly, we just don't know. She's the Egyptian queen we have the most images and records of, and yet the one we know the least about. We don't know who her parents were, but what grabs everyone's attention is her stunning beauty, a face that at first glance looks almost modern. Thanks to her husband Akhenaten, the rebel pharaoh, her name survived. Akhenaten went down in history for introducing Aten, the sun god, as the one and only god, replacing Egypt's many traditional gods. During his reign in the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten built new temples, many of them roofless to let sunlight shine in. His new religion also centered around a personal cult. Gradually, he and the sun god became almost one and the same. Nefertiti and Akhenaten were also ancient Egypt's most romantic royal couple. Their love started very young. Statues show her as only 14 years old. For the first time, people saw two teenage rulers of an empire, holding hands, visibly in love. Some carvings even show them hugging each other. On royal chariots, Akhenaten is shown kissing Nefertiti. There's a scene where the queen puts a necklace around the king's neck, and he uses the moment to kiss her on the cheek. It's a deeply intimate image, probably reflecting real love. In the 7th year of their reign, Akhenaten and Nefertiti left Karnak and moved to Amarna in the middle of the desert. There they built a brand new royal city called Akhetaten, meaning Horizon of the Aten. In this quickly built modern city, big enough for 50,000 people, the famous royal couple lived among temples open to the sky, spending much of their time worshipping the sun god. But their rule lasted only 17 years. After their deaths, successors erased every trace of them and dismantled their palaces stone by stone. Within 30 years, the city vanished back into the desert sands, like a sandy Pompeii. When you excavate buildings from the 18th dynasty, the only period they were occupied was during Akhenaten's reign, a bit over 15 years. This gives us a true picture of life in Egypt at that time. It was in this 5 by 10 kilometer patch of desert that on December 6, 1912, the bust of Nefertiti was discovered, perfectly intact. Ludwig Borchardt, born in Berlin in 1863, became one of the most famous archaeologists of his time. He was fascinated by Egypt's monuments and architecture. In 1906, he organized a German excavation in the ruins of Akhenaten's city, a ghost town to some, but to Borchardt, it promised the discovery of the century. On December 6, 1912, with his team around him, he made that unforgettable find, the famous limestone bust of Nefertiti, buried only about 50 centimeters under gravel. Before the Germans arrived, the site had been almost a British zone, led by their top archaeologist, Sir Flinders Petrie. He'd directed big digs there in 1891 and 1892, opening tombs, revealing beautiful wall paintings and the foundations of palaces. But they'd never found anything like the Nefertiti bust. When Borchardt's team arrived, the British were skeptical and even laughed at them, sure the Germans would find nothing. Petrie himself had stopped digging there at the end of the 19th century, convinced there was nothing left to find. Clearly he was wrong. Borchardt came to Amarna initially because he saw it as a key site for studying local architecture, but he also had strong ties to the Berlin Museum, and he wanted something spectacular to bring back to Berlin. At the start of the 20th century, Egypt was the biggest treasure hunt on Earth. Prussia had fallen behind in the race. Kaiser Wilhelm ordered Borchardt to come back with something big, no matter what. Before the dig began, Borchardt got advice from leading archaeologists in Cairo, many of whom worked closely with looters. He was told a part of Akhenaten's old city hadn't yet been excavated. Borchardt, who was also an architect, drew detailed plans of the southeastern sector, an area once occupied by craftsmen, untouched by the British and looters. He started digging in the larger villas, recognizable on site by small mounds. Later, he extended the dig to every house. By a stroke of extraordinary luck, he discovered the offices and home of the sculptor Thutmose, Akhenaten and Nefertiti's personal artist. Borchardt realized he had found an estate full of sculptors' studios. Driven by excitement, he decided to excavate every square inch of the gardens. Behind the granaries, he identified the master craftsman Thutmose's house, where it said Borchardt found the bust. Following in his footsteps a century later, archaeologists retraced the discovery. Using Borchardt's detailed notes and sketches, they pinpointed the exact spot. A reception room where Thutmose likely welcomed important guests, and maybe even Nefertiti herself. Leaving that room, there was the sculptor's studio, and in one corner, exactly where Borchardt wrote in his notes, they found the queen's bust, buried for over 3,200 years, yet astonishingly lifelike. That wasn't all. The sculptor's house turned out to be full of treasures. Borchardt also found other busts from that period, strange and realistic plaster masks, unfinished models of Akhenaten, and even the now famous damaged bust of Akhenaten himself. Ludwig Borchardt donated all his amazing finds to the museum in Berlin. But in this whole archaeological tale, there's one detail that caught the attention of historians, something that sparked an investigation worthy of a detective novel. In his colonial-style house in Cairo, Borchardt waited over 10 years before publishing the full report on his excavations at Tel el-Amarna. He described how he found the limestone bust of Nefertiti and another limestone bust of Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose face was broken. In his field notes, Borchardt paid special attention to where exactly Nefertiti's bust was found, and also noted the location of the damaged Akhenaten bust. According to his sketches, Nefertiti's bust was sitting on a shelf in the corner of the studio. The Akhenaten bust was found first, lying on the ground near the entrance on the left. Over time, the outer wall had collapsed, supposedly bringing the Nefertiti bust down with it. Akhenaten's bust was found in several pieces, but strangely, Nefertiti's bust was completely intact, as if she had just left the sculptor's studio. Swiss historian Henri Stierlin, who investigated the case for 20 years, concluded that the whole story was a fabrication by Borchardt. He questioned Borchardt's report and summed it up by saying Nefertiti was just too beautiful to be real. He doubted how such a heavy object could fall about 1.5 meters from a shelf onto stones and rubble without breaking, especially if, as Borchardt claimed, it fell face first. Stierlin argued that something so delicate couldn't fall like that and come out unharmed, especially if only the ears were damaged, which doesn't make sense because the ears wouldn't even hit the ground first. When Stierlin began his investigation in 1984, he shared his doubts with Dietrich Wildung, one of Germany's top archaeologists and then the director of the Munich Museum. Wildung had studied the bust for years and admitted he shared Stierlin's doubts. He even wrote Stierlin a letter saying, "Your project is convincing and coherent." In that letter, Wildung confessed his own concerns about the bust's condition and style, saying it didn't quite fit the Amarna period, and he was even ready to write the introduction to Stierlin's report. But in 1989, Wildung was appointed curator of the Nefertiti bust, and things changed dramatically. Suddenly, Wildung sent Stierlin another letter, saying he had been made director at the Berlin Museum, where the bust is displayed, and that the whole case had taken on a different meaning. He now had to distance himself from the investigation and couldn't be involved anymore. What worried Stierlin most was that 2 representatives from Berlin came to pressure him to stop his research. But Stierlin was not easily intimidated and continued his investigation, though now completely on his own. Intrigued by the story, the filmmakers traveled to Berlin to meet Wildung. But on the eve of their meeting, Wildung canceled. They called him again, pretending they hadn't received his message. "Hello, Mr. Wildung here. Mr. Dietrich Wildung, yes. I'm calling about the meeting tomorrow on Nefertiti. I wanted to confirm when we could meet. I sent an email today. I completely refused to talk about this. Otherwise, I could face serious problems." They discovered that the German authorities had officially banned Wildung from speaking about the bust, or even mentioning Stierlin's research. To Stierlin, the bust was the result of an experiment. Borchardt had made a copy of the bust to study sculpting techniques on plaster, especially how the ancient Egyptians applied color. After all, Borchardt had everything he needed right there at Tel el-Amarna: limestone, plaster, pigments. Plaster is fairly easy to make and, well, it can't be dated scientifically. The stone itself, limestone, is found everywhere in Egypt. It's a limestone country. Borchardt could take a big chunk of limestone, shape it to the right size, cover it with plaster, and then have a sculptor make a high-quality copy. He also had many original heads and faces on site he could use as references, including an unfinished but genuine model of Nefertiti found in Thutmose's studio. This model even had carbon marks showing where more carving was planned. Did Borchardt use a model like this one to create his copy? After all, his notes were incredibly detailed, mentioning large quantities of pigments that were still usable. But if this was just an experimental copy, why didn't Borchardt mention it to his team, or in his otherwise meticulous notes? According to Stierlin, on December 5, 1912, Borchardt was in Cairo. He learned that a German royal family was visiting and wanted to see his excavation site. Borchardt rushed back to Tel el-Amarna, arriving on December 6th, a day that was supposed to be a holiday for the workers. He put them back to work immediately. Later, he proudly showed the royals his discovery. In the excitement, one of the dig foremen, a local Egyptian named el-Sanusi, briefly disappeared during the visit, then returned holding the Nefertiti bust. The royals were delighted and a photo was taken to capture the moment. At that point, Borchardt had no chance to explain that this was just a copy, not the real thing. Stierlin claimed the photo itself trapped Borchardt. He couldn't tell the excited royals, "Sorry, this isn't genuine. That would have embarrassed them, insulted the royal family, and could have destroyed Borchardt's career and life. After the royal visit, the bust mysteriously disappeared for nearly 11 years. It's said that Borchardt gave it to his patron, James Simon, the wealthy businessman who had funded part of the excavation. Simon kept the bust on his coffee table at home for about a decade, from 1912 to 1924. During that time, Borchardt systematically refused to show the Queen to the public. At first, he might not have realized that the missing eye was a major insult to her image and dignity. A one-eyed Nefertiti was effectively a blasphemy, a betrayal of the royal image of Egypt's great queen. To learn more, the filmmakers visited the University of Liège in Belgium, where Dimitri Lebery, one of the top experts on ancient Egyptian art, shared his thoughts. It's basically a tool, a studio model used by artists so they could produce identical copies of the official image of Nefertiti approved by Akhenaten and probably by Nefertiti herself. Lebery explained that the bust and similar pieces were communication tools. The official portrait of the queen had to be instantly recognizable to priests and people across all of Egypt. As for the missing eye, experts say this was normal in a studio model, to help measure the precise depth needed when inlaying the eye. Lebery described it as a classic studio piece from the el-Amarna family style. If you look at the mouth of Akhenaten, the mouths of the el-Amarna princesses, or the father-in-law of Nefertiti, they all have that same distinctive shape, full of sensuality and elegance. The strongest argument for the bust being genuine had already been challenged by another leading German Egyptologist, Rolf Krauss. He discovered the bust was sculpted using a precise grid system based on the Egyptian finger unit of measurement, which is about 1.875 centimeters. While Britain and the United States use feet and inches, the ancient Egyptians used the finger. Krauss showed how the sculptor used this grid to map anatomical reference points. For example, the base of the nose and the mouth aligned precisely with these measurements. This way, the whole face, from chin to crown, was built to a strict system based on the Egyptian finger. For a modern forger, especially one from the early 20th century, to do this correctly, they'd have to know and apply this ancient system, not modern centimeters. Krauss argued this system was designed so copies of Nefertiti's bust could be made consistently across Egypt. But early 1900s, forgers probably didn't even know it existed. Another anomaly Stierlin pointed out was the vertically cut shoulders. Egyptian busts are usually cut horizontally across the shoulders. Vertical cuts are extremely rare. Was Nefertiti's bust really the only one in ancient Egyptian art with vertically cut shoulders? To check, the filmmakers returned to the Neues Museum in Berlin. Director Friederike Seefried explained there was, in fact, another example, also discovered by Borchardt in 1912 and never shown publicly before. Disturbed by the controversy around Stierlin's book, Seefried searched the museum's storage rooms and found it. Yes, there are other busts with vertically cut shoulders from the Tel el-Amarna excavations. You can clearly see the central axis line and the shoulders cut just like the colored bust of the queen. So there was a second bust cut the same way. But is that enough to prove Nefertiti's authenticity once and for all? In Berlin, the Neues Museum tried to settle the debate by putting the bust through a kind of lie detector, a CT scan. Could science finally prove she's real? The scan revealed the bust was carved from a block of limestone and covered with layers of plaster, allowing the sculptor, or maybe a forger, to tweak certain details. It showed the bust had been modified. From behind, the scan clearly showed that the right shoulder was higher than the left. Plaster was used to adjust and smooth out the curve of the neck, as well as to refine the cheeks, cheekbones, and even the bridge of the nose. Subscribe and explore the forgotten past with us. Like, share, and support the journey to uncover truth beneath the ruins.